Hi there. Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, February 27th. My name is Heather Kraus, and I am the founder of an organization called We All Count. And the purpose of We All Count is to build tools and provide training that helps anybody that is working on a data project make choices and decisions in that data project that will make sure that their values and their communities are prioritized in the evidence that they are generating. And really, the highlight of my week every week is Friday's Talking Data Equity. That's what you have found your way to today. And we have this informal drop in, no charge gathering most Fridays. You can visit the Talking Data Equity home site, which I just put in the chat, to find out what our topic is, or if we have a guest speaker, or if we're doing a code along. And you're always welcome to come. And also, we do record these sessions, most of them. And so if you're interested in the topic and you can't attend live, you can go to our data equity forum. I just put the chat a link in the chat as well. And you can watch the recordings, you can ask questions, you can look for resources. The data equity forum is also a public good. It's not a membership site. You don't have to pay any money to belong. And we are in there every day, along with lots and lots of your friends and colleagues, just having conversations about how can we get our communities and our values centered and priorities and centered, prioritized, and embedded in the actual quantitative evidence that we generate, not just talk about it, but actually do it. and so let me introduce you to two amazing special guests that our mind is blown that we are going to get to spend this hour together. And just a tiny bit of housekeeping. Our two special guests are going to share some examples, share some really cool tools. While they're doing that, we ask that you keep your microphone turned off. Feel free to use the Zoom chat to share reflections, to connect with other people that are attending, and to ask questions. We have the Zoom chat set up so that you can talk so that everybody can see your comment, or you can direct message me if you'd like to ask a question in private. That's perfectly fine. But we ask that you keep your microphones turned off for the first part, and time permitting, we will have a microphone on discussion and Q&A time period. Okay, so while I introduce our special guest, we are also going to ask you all to introduce yourselves into the chat. We would love to know what your name is, maybe where you are geographically, but what we'd really love to know is what is your favorite United States federal data set? And if you are joining us from a country that's not the United States, like I am, I'm in Toronto, you can either put in your favorite US federal data set, or you can put your favorite federal data set from the country that you are joining us from. So go ahead and introduce yourselves into the chat. And I'm going to introduce our special guests. We have two amazing people joining us today. We have Beth Jarosz, who has 25 years of experience in understanding and communicating the nuance of data to help decision makers answer complex questions. Beth's career has spanned local government, academic, nonprofit, and contractor roles. Currently, she is a senior fellow at the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown University, a collaborator at Data Index US, and vice president of the Association of Public Data Users, which is a website that we all explored in Talking Data Equity a couple of weeks ago. So we were amazed that Beth was able and willing to make time to join us. We are so, so grateful. And we also are joined by Denise Ross, who is currently a senior advisor at the Federation of American Scientists, where she's building the federal data use case repository, which documents the value that federal data sets bring to American lives and livelihood. Lots of you know Denise already because she served as the U.S. Chief Data Scientist, where she led the charge to use disaggregated data to drive better outcomes for all America. And I love what Denise has written in her LinkedIn. I'm an optimistic, forward-thinking professional who knows firsthand the power of data to advance progress on our nation's biggest challenges. And I think that is a very, very good aspiration that many of us here today aspire to. So I'm going to turn it over to Denise and Beth, and you all can keep introducing yourselves into the chat while they share their amazing stories. Beth, Denise, thank you so much for making time in your schedules to join us today.
Thanks, Heather. It certainly feels like we're in the right place watching this chat and everybody's favorite data sets. It's such an honor to be here today. And I just wanted to start with a story about my time in the Biden administration. When people ask me what I did as the chief data scientist of the United States, it was actually, I just really had one job, and that was to build federal agency capacity to sort of the data backbone to support the president's equity agenda. And we did that by disaggregating data. So that could be by race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, geography, like rural versus urban, military connectedness, disability, whatever the characteristics are that were policy relevant, so that we could make sure that we were not leaving any Americans behind in the programs that we were designing or the policies that we were making. And one way this manifested was in the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So this was a generational investment in America's communities, like $1.3 trillion or something. And our team inside of the White House was responsible for gathering the data, actually sort of creating the data from reports that came in from agencies about where the money was going to be going for this. So sort of the early indicators of which jurisdictions had received funding from the infrastructure law. And we would put those dots on a map, and then the president would stand in front of the map and talk about how we were, serving all of America with this great investment in the infrastructure law. And behind the scenes, the most important thing that we did, and we built the capacity of hundreds of federal data experts to do, was to really slice and dice that data so that we could understand not where are the dots, but what counties don't have any investments going to them. Because then you can make a mid-course correction and you can provide, for example, technical assistance to rural communities that seem to be not knowing about or not having the capacity to apply. Or maybe you might see patterns. When we did this analysis, actually, it won't surprise you that the pattern was not random. So, we were surveying like 99% of America's counties, but when you looked at that 1%, it was a common pattern of places that are historically left behind, like the Southern Black Belt, the border along Mexico, tribal nations, and Appalachia. And these patterns are predictable, and you can design interventions to make things more fair. So that was that work with disaggregated data was really critical for making sure that our policies were meeting their full potential. And the great thing about working with disaggregated data like that is that as a data practitioner, once you've learned to peek under the hood, so once you no longer take that, we're meeting 99% of everybody's needs. Like once you realize like, we need to look at who's not being served. We need to look at that 1% and see what communities are disparately impacted. You can't unsee those patterns, and it affects every data analysis that you do moving forward. And in order to be able to do that type of disaggregated analysis, you have to collect data that's timely and detailed and relevant to the policies and decisions that need to be made. And that's what Beth and I are going to talk to about today is the current state of the federal data apparatus. As society changes, we have to modernize our data systems accordingly, and that takes a constant sort of renewal of effort and expertise in the field, and there has to be intentionality behind that. And what we've seen over the last year and some change is a real sort of degradation of federal data capacity, and that's going to have very real implications for our ability to understand how policies are working and how they're affecting different populations in the U.S. So I wanted to just quickly outline what patterns that we're seeing. I'm betting you've seen the news, and it just probably feels like you're getting whiplash, right? About like what's happening with the Department of Education's data collections and the census and the jobs data and weather data And so, some patterns have emerged. So I will share with you what we've seen. The first sort of highest profile data losses that we saw were at the beginning of the administration. And those were data that were removed in response to some day one executive orders, mostly targeting DEI, gender identity, and climate. And and many data sets were pulled down to comply with the short timeline for implementation of those executive actions, but most of those data sets were then put back. Hundreds of them, though, did have elements removed, in particular around gender identity. Some data collections expanded beyond even the scope of the executive actions to remove data about sexual orientation. We saw DEI data, for example, race and ethnicity data disappeared from the data set that Office of Personnel Management publishes about the federal workforce. So as changes are happening to the federal workforce in this massive sort of disruption, we don't have data that describes whether there's any disproportionality in those changes. And another specific example is that gender identity was removed from the National Crime Victimization Survey. So that's really the bucket of data that were not aligned with administration priorities and were pulled for that reason. The second bucket is the one that's going to be harder to recover from and has probably the longest, the most widespread damage, and that is what I like to think of as just collateral damage. So not necessarily politicization or targeting of removal of data sets, but it's because the entire federal workforce is being reduced. So we have fewer staff to do the works. And in many cases, entire offices that used to be responsible for a data set have been removed. Contractors who play a critical role, often in data collection or making sure that the systems that are used to store sensitive data are secure. So contracts have been canceled. Many of the scientific advisory committees that are actually all of them that are important for making sure that we're collecting data in modern ways so that the collection continues to be high quality and meeting the needs of American society. Those advisory committees were terminated, so we don't have that expertise anymore. And then also many collections sort of flow up from state and local government, public health authorities, local law enforcement agencies, and whatnot. And as federal funding streams have dried up or become uncertain, those supply chains coming from state and locals are also at risk because it takes a lot of capacity and resources, human resources and technical resources, to produce data that then becomes nationwide statistics. A couple of examples of what we've seen in terms of collateral damage. One was the termination of a Department of Homeland Security collection called HIFILD. I won't even try to say what that acronym stands for, but it was basically a digital go bag for the nation's emergency managers. So it would tell them in one place, it was just a collection of data sets from all over the federal space that would tell them where hazards were that might be, you'd want to know where they are, like nuclear reactors or concentrated animal feeding operations. So if a disaster happens, you know where those hazards could be making things worse. And it also tells you where vulnerable people are, like people in nursing homes or childcare centers, hospitals who might need to be rescued. And then lastly, it showed where assets are that might be able to be used as resources, for example, emergency rooms or large parking lots that could be used for staging rescues and whatnot. So that data collection was terminated. Another example is the Drug Abuse Warning Network, and that is a collection from the nation's emergency departments that gives early intelligence on new illicit drugs that are entering into communities that are sending people to the emergency rooms. And that's something that public health officials and law enforcement agencies and even schools want to know about, what the new trends are in neighboring jurisdictions, because they want to be prepared for when it comes their way. So that's just a couple of examples: the Drug Abuse Warning Network and the digital go bag for the nation's emergency managers. There was nothing particularly like politically awkward about those data collections. It was just they just died because the resources disappeared. And then the third bucket is and we're starting to see more of this, is the termination or weakening of data that reflect poorly on the performance of administration policies. We started to see this last summer when the Social Security Administration removed performance data that included information on how long people have to stay on hold when they call the National Call Center. This was following the the departure of more than 5,000 Social Security staff and many of their field offices at a time when anti-fraud measures in Social Security Administration were increasing. So there was probably more reason for people to be calling to get help to understand what was happening with their files. Another example is last August, and this was very high profile, after a disappointing jobs report that reflected poorly on some of the economic policies. The Bureau of Labor Statistics commissioner was fired, and there was some discussion that the numbers from the administration, the numbers had been rigged. So the data was being disparaged, and the leadership there was terminated. And then one of the most high-profile data terminations that we've seen with timing that certainly implies that this was about not wanting to show the reflect negatively on the performance of administration policies was when the USDA announced they were canceling the food security supplement. That's the only federal collection that details whether Americans have dependable access to enough safe and healthy food to live a healthy life. It's the only collection that gives us this data for children and also at the state level. And the timing of this kicked in just as millions of Americans were due to fall off the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or food stamps. And another example is the greenhouse gas reporting program, which is the only way that we have insights into large greenhouse gas emission sources like gas suppliers and whatnot. And that was, of course, timed alongside the weakening of climate regulations. So those last two buckets, the collateral damage, just because of the decreasing federal capacity for data, and this new pattern that we're seeing where collections are terminated or weakened when they might reflect poorly on administration policies. I expect over the next year or two, we're going to see more of that, especially as the staffing and contracting cuts and the other diminishment of capacity really start to kick in, just because of the natural lag in how long it takes to produce federal data. So 2026 will start to be, we might be expecting data, but it comes late. It doesn't show up. It might be skinnier than usual. It might not have the documentation that it used to. It might be even harder to get to. We're already seeing examples like the pregnancy risk assessment monitoring system, where a researcher used to be able to go to the CDC to get that critical data on maternal and infant mortality. But now they have to individually ask each of the 50 states. And they have to normalize that data themselves rather than the CDC doing that work. So more friction introduced into the process of getting and using data. And so with that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Beth, to give us a more detailed glimpse into what we're doing to keep an eye on this.
Thank you, Denise. That's sort of a perfect segue. I've put a couple links in the chat as we have gone, but there's one more I want to put in here, and then I'll share my screen. I'm going to attempt to go to live websites, which is always dangerous, but I have backup slides just in case. So any of you, if you want to, are welcome to walk along with me. I'm going to do just a very quick spin through one of the ways that we are tracking the things that Denise is talking about. Because as you can imagine, across tens of thousands of data sets across the entire federal government, it is very hard to keep track of all of these things. So we work in collaboration with a bunch of different organizations to share information, share knowledge, and try to get it out to the public about how data systems are changing. And one of the tools that we're using is this dataindex.us website that I put in the chat. When you go here, there are a couple of different directions that Data Index takes, one of which is there are what are called information collection requests. In the United States, when the federal government is collecting data, they have to issue an information collection request as part of the rules under the Paperwork Reduction Act. They are a little bit arcane, and so what our team does is read through all of those to identify places where it's sort of important to take action. So there is an inventory of those on the site. And then we also we condense it down a little bit into what we call take action. So it gives a little bit more. Sorry, I'm realizing that I cannot actually see the tabs the way that Zoom is set up. We have a take action section where it gives you a little bit more information about, like, here's the information collection request, and here's a summary of what is proposed. Realizing still that many of you are very busy and not necessarily going to be able to read through all of these and, like, go to the website and check these things every month. We also have a newsletter where we do a quick summary of here are, 4 to 6 things that we've noticed in the past week that we think are worth your time and attention. And then send that out regularly. And I'll talk about some of those pieces in a moment. And then one of the newer pieces of what we're doing is something called the data checkup. As Denise mentioned, there are a bunch of different dimensions of risk, one of which is completely losing a data set, like that high-filled data set that she was talking about earlier, that tool where across 6 different dimensions of risk, and I'll talk about what those are in a moment, you'll see that these are all black for high filled. That's because the data are gone. And so this gives you a really quick view of, oh, wow, this one, something's really distinctly going wrong here. And then for other data sets, like if we go up to the American Community Survey, we see that, a bunch of it seems like it's probably okay. So let's go in, and this is the live piece. Let's go into the American Community Survey, and I'll talk you through each of those pieces. For each one of the data sets that we're monitoring, we have a brief summary of what the data is about. We look at the historical data availability. Has any data been removed from the public domain? In the case of the American Community Survey, the answer there is no. Historical data are still available. We look at future data availability and we give it a risk score, and you can get some additional context about what those specific risks are. But in this case, American Community Survey is ongoing. We have not seen big disruptions except for the fairly long government shutdown. And when there is a period of disrupted data collection or disrupted staffing at the Bureau, we expect delays in the data. And sometimes, as we saw in 2020, if enough weeks of data collection are disrupted, you might not get the data for that year. And so there is some risk right now because of the shutdown for American Community Survey, but otherwise, we do expect that one will be okay. No known issues with data quality. And you'll notice we're saying no known issue. We are not confident enough in any of these things to say, these are fine, because there may be things that our team doesn't know about. But to the best of our knowledge, we don't expect there to be any big disruptions to data quality in the American Community Survey. We also look at statutory context. Is the survey required by law? Is it used for programs that are required by law, but it's not required? Or is there no statutory context, statutory requirement? And that gives us a risk of, if there's no statutory requirement, then that might be easier to chop. Staffing and funding. As Denise mentioned, the Census Bureau has lost quite a bit of staffing. It's not one of the biggest losses. They are still producing their work, and so we give it a moderate risk there. And then policy, we'll come to one where we go into policy in more detail in just a moment. If we look at another data set, if we look at the Consumer Price Index, you'll see a slightly different pattern here. Similar issues around historical data availability and statutory context. This one's a principal federal economic indicator, so we really strongly require that this be collected. We did have some shutdown-related disruptions, so those are pretty similar to ACS. With Bureau of Labor Statistics, we're into a higher risk for staffing and funding for a couple of reasons. Denise mentioned the BLS commissioner was removed. That seeming political interference is a risk for us, even though the acting commissioner is very well respected and is the Bureau of Labor Statistics is doing their work as they're supposed to be. That political targeting of the head of the BLS to us is flagged as a risk. In addition, they have had such big staffing reductions at the Bureau of Labor Statistics that they have actually scaled back data collections, including reductions in the number of observations they're collecting for those consumer price index indicators. And so you see that show up in a couple of places. We see it mentioned in staffing. You'll also notice that a bunch of these citations are in blue. We're sort of proving, we're giving you the receipts. We're not just saying it's high risk, but we are giving you the here's a resource, a verifiable resource where yes, the commissioner was removed. Yes, the leadership roles are vacant. Yes, there are concerns about staffing, and then some hiring has resumed at BLS. Um, and then last but not least, on consumer price index, we're calling this one a moderate risk because of those, here under staffing, we've got reductions and we're actually seeing it show up in data quality where there's been about a 15% reduction in data collection broadly, and 3 cities have been completely suspended for data collection. And then I saw a bunch of people talking about um, BRFSS and YRBS in chat. I don't know if I saw anyone talk about this one, but it's my personal favorite for children's health is the National Survey of Children's Health, where we have in this case, we have an issue with historical data availability. There had been a question on adversity or being treated unfairly because of sexual orientation or gender identity. It was asked for several years, and it was removed in the technical documentation and in the downloadable data in February of 2025. And we have the receipts to prove that that's the case. The statutory context here is a high risk because although the Health and Human Services is able to collect it, there's no mandate for it being collected. They are also among those that are harder hit in terms of staffing. And we do see a policy implication here where, as we noted, gender-related data were removed, and we see that showing up in the policy risk here in terms of dimensions of risk. So this is sort of one quick level way of keeping track of your favorite indicator. We have just over 24 of these now, and we're working on adding more data sets with this kind of collection or this kind of risk assessment or sort of data health checkup as we go. Now, again, you're not necessarily going to go to the website and be checking these things regularly, although if you have a favorite data set, you might want to. So we also have a newsletter from Data Index where we post, like I said, those take action. Here are the top things that we've noticed in the past week that are important. We've also started what's called a rapid response series, where as these changes are being proposed, there's often a comment period that allows you to submit comments and give the government feedback about whether you think this is a good thing for them to do the data collection or make the changes they proposed or something that gives you concern. And so lots of people didn't know that this process even existed. And so what we started about 6 months ago was a 30-minute webinar when we see a really impactful issue, a place where people's voices could make a difference. We will send out an announcement about a rapid response where we bring together a panel of technical experts that will tell you what's in this data set, why is it important, what are the risks, and Denise is often our risk reviewer, and then how specifically can you take action? Click on this link, submit your comment using this thing. You can summarize the risks that we've given you, and you can go to the newsletter page and look through some the past recordings are probably less useful because oftentimes the comment periods have already closed. But if you sign up for the newsletter, you will get additional information about that. Those rapid response webinars are done in partnership across a couple of organizations, the Association of Public Data Users, and I'll put this link in the chat once I'm not sharing screen, also is one of the partners in that, and it also has a newsletter that is focused on those rapid response news about data privacy, and upcoming events. So highly encourage you to sign up for that. And last but not least, if you want not just newsletters coming into your inbox, but a way to communicate with other people in the data ecosystem. The Federal Data Forum is a peer-to-peer information sharing system. Anyone can look at the discussion threads in this forum and see what has been discussed. But if you want to engage, you have a question. Hey, I work with YRBS, and does anyone know when the next batch of data is coming out? Or, hey, I know that I saw PRAMS was going to get renewed, but I still don't have that nationwide data. Does anyone have any update on that? You can ask the question and get answers from across the data user community there. And let's see, I think that was, oh, and last but not least, I put this link in the chat earlier. Denise had mentioned a couple of terminated data sets, but that is a partner project with America's Essential Data, where you can go and see that list of, yes, thousands of websites got pulled down. And then many got put back up as they came back up. These are the things that either never came back or have been terminated since February of 2025. So I will stop sharing there and pop those links into the chat, and we would both love to take questions.
Thank you so much, Denise and Beth. I really, really appreciate it. And as you can see, there's tons of appreciation from everybody who is live with us today. And if you are live with us today, these new Zoom things are so cool. It just, it just makes your Friday better.
Yeah.
So if you're live with us today and you would like to ask a question, this is your opportunity. There is a couple hundred people here. So probably the best way to do it is if you can find under the reactions in the Zoom menu how to raise your Zoom hand. We'll call on you in the order that you raise your Zoom hand. If you really can't figure out how to raise your Zoom hand, you can just turn your microphone on and we will make it work. And also, if you don't want to use your microphone to ask a question, you can ask it in the chat. And there are lots and lots of questions already in the chat, but let's just give it 60 seconds or 30 seconds to see if anybody wants to turn their microphone on to jumpstart the questions. If not, I'll go to the chat. All right. So we're going to go to the chat, and one of the questions in the chat that I really, really loved was when we look at the little cards on that data index website, were there any that surprised you about how well those data sets are doing?
That's a really good question. I'm going to say no, but only because when we were picking the data sets to start with, we had gone through an exercise to try to make sure we had a variety of different data sets, like ones that we knew would be really highly at risk and targeted, and ones that we knew were pretty secure and stable. If anything, I was actually a little surprised by like we've kind of figured early on in this process that the economic indicators would be safe, so to speak. And so then seeing the hits that the consumer price index took, that was surprising. That because we figured that was one of the ones we added because we thought it would be okay. Knowing that the American Community Survey is safe or like is performing fairly well. I don't want to say pleasantly surprised, but that one has a lot of advocacy behind it. There are community advocates, there are business leaders, like there's AI groups. There's a book about the development of image processing and AI by Fei Li. She specifically calls out the American Community Survey as one of the tools that she used in developing AI models. So there's just a really great core constituency there. So I would say not surprised in a good way, unfortunately.
That's okay. We can always hope.
Yeah.
Denise, you're nodding. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I will just say a group of federal data watchers and I got together in my dining room a few weeks after the election and put up a bunch of post-it notes on the walls about like everything that we would think might happen and how we would know what was happening and what we could do about it. And pretty much everything that we anticipated might happen has happened, but it happened so much more quickly. And I had really expected the larger risk to be the like those more specific attacks on data that were not aligned with administration priorities or reflected poorly on the policies. But I'm really awestruck by just the damage that's caused by the loss of federal staff and contractors. And we don't there's so much we don't even have visibility on. What we with dataindex.us, we've really started with the data that have the most visibility, and that's data collected through forms and surveys that are subject to the Paperwork Reduction Act. But for example, if you've got a ground-based radar system that feeds into a model that warns communities about incoming tornadoes, human beings need to maintain that hardware. And in some places that's a federal staffer, in some places that's a contractor. And when a tornado warning is not as robust as it should be, like we're at the point where, people are going to start looking at like whether the data inputs suffered because of this diminished federal data capacity. And that's just across domains, every single data set that you might just take for granted. Like, for example, the Consumer Product Safety Commission's product recall
Right.
database, that warned me a couple years ago that the peanut butter in my pantry might have salmonella. If the staff behind that can't keep it up or something with the technology fails, then people won't know that the products that they ordered from, an online grocer, for example, might be dangerous for them to eat.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Those are great examples. You're both so excellent at giving us like the concreteness. And that's true of both of these tools that you're sharing. I really, really appreciate that. Julie Huber, do you have your mic on to ask a question? Maybe not. Okay. One question that is coming up frequently in the chat is so there's a couple hundred of us here that are all, lots of have experienced losing employment for the exact reasons that you're talking about. So some of us have more time than we used to. If there was one thing that you would recommend the data folks that are here today do as a practical step to kind of keep moving this forward, we really want to help build momentum. None of us here are other than, a few. Most of us here are not doing this as our full-time job around US federal data, but we really want to do what we can to help fuel the momentum, keep the momentum going. Do you have a recommendation of a practical action that we could take?
I can take just something that so I think we're all in a position now where we're no longer taking federal data for granted.
Yeah.
And in our daily work, and especially if we're producing data products or interactive tools, often companies and nonprofits and even media outlets don't don't give full credit to the fact that these data came from federal
Mm.
sources.
Hmm.
And so being much more explicit about when we are using federal data and the value that it's providing. I remember in the last decennial census, there was a behavior and attitude survey that asked people if census data were a unique product. And many people said no, because they could get the same data from Google.
Ah.
Because so much of these federal
Hmm.
data are people don't experience them directly. Most of the time, they don't experience them directly from the federal government. They experience, for example, the data from Department of Education on school performance. They experience that through real estate sites like Zillow and Redfin.
Right.
So they don't realize, like, oh, that actually comes from the Department of Education,
Hmm.
not from this commercial entity. Or
Right.
AccuWeather and other, other weather apps, that heat index that allows a football coach to move practice inside when it's dangerously hot, so his football players won't die of heat stroke. Um, that data is not coming from the app; it's coming from the federal government.
Right. Yeah. Okay, that's great. There's lots of people here who have some decision-making power around that, at least in their local context. Beth,
The
what
oth-
were you thinking?
yeah, the other piece that I would add, so 100% agree with Denise about telling the stories about where data are from and why they're important. Super helpful. The other piece is the I shared those links about like how to stay engaged, how to take
Mhm.
action, not because it's like self-promotion. It's because
Yeah.
our whole purpose with that is this is something you can spend 30 minutes with us or even just read the newsletter, and we're going to give you the link to click on and some key points that you can submit a comment about. Leading up to this year, there were often data sets where when that comment period was opened, there would be a single comment on something. And this is an administration that sees, whether they're going to respond to our comments or not, this is an administration that sees those metrics and goes, no one's using this data because only one person responded. When we started doing the rapid response series, we found that, before we hold an event, there might be like 4 or 5 comments in the
Hmm.
system. After we hold an event, we've seen as between like 80 and 150 comments submitted in the 24 hours after. So the more people who are commenting and saying, "Hey, I use this data for X. I don't want you to take this question out because it is important for Y, or I oppose these changes for Z reason." The more people who are doing that, the harder it is for them to like. I'm not saying it's always going to work, but the
Right.
harder it is to say this data set's not important. We're going to make this change, and even if they're not going to change because this came up when we were talking about the pregnancy risk assessment monitoring system, PRAMS. There was a comment period and there was a little tension about, well, you're supposed to just comment on the data. But the problem here is actually the staffing, that CDC might continue this program, but if there's no one to help states crunch the numbers, if there's no one to provide technical assistance, if there's no consolidation of the data, then it's not so helpful. That's okay to put in your comment too. And then even if they don't respond, maybe a future litigator will, if they're going to sue for complete implementation of the program or they're going to sue for the data release, they've got that public record of all of the things people said, and they can point to that and say, hey, judge, 180 people said that this is a really important thing to do. And again, not all of them are going to be successful, but we're trying to make it as simple as like, here's the 5-minute action that you can take this week.
That is so helpful. We as a group learned how to do that. I think it was about almost 2 years ago now when they were considering adding the Middle East part to the census. We all kind of did a walkthrough and learned how to add comments. So that is really helpful because this group knows how to do that. And it can feel very defeatist, right? Like if you're like, no, this doesn't matter. Somebody way above me is making this decision. But the examples that you just gave were so concrete. And, even your comment today, if it doesn't change the needle right now, there's next week, there's next year. Andy, great to see you. How you doing? Go ahead.
It's good to see all of you. I so appreciate the session. So, okay, so my question, I'm gonna describe this as something that happened yesterday. I'm getting my hair cut, right? And my hairdresser says, "How's work?" And I'm trying to describe to her some of the things I'm working on. And in my case, I'm focused on what we can do in California to address threats to federal data. And you've already provided some good ideas, but I guess I also want to have a group conversation if others have ideas in the chat. How do I describe this to what seems like a wonky topic to people who are really not that interested in data, but who could be impacted, of course, by it? And I like the idea of providing, you know, examples as like, well, these are the data set, like your peanut butter example, for example. But I feel like I'm going to lose their interest really quickly. And especially in light of everything else that's happening in the world right now that feel urgent. And this feels like a tomorrow problem. And I'm curious, Beth and Denise, if you have any thoughts, because you guys have been talking about this a lot. And if others have thoughts, I'd love to see it in the chat. And I'm just going to put in the chat, I have a survey about threats to federal data that's specific to folks in California. And so if you are in California or do work in California, I'm just going to put the link to that survey in the chat because I'd love to have your input. But anyway, any thoughts that you guys have, I'd be curious to know.
I point them to Denise and say she's got great examples. I mean,
Maybe I'll do, Denise, if you don't mind coming to my next haircut, that would be.
Yeah. Well, I want to answer your question, Andy, and also Lisa Knobloch had a question about aligning comments with administration priorities. And I will just admit that like I can write use case studies about how data can drive more equitable outcomes till the cows come home. Like,
Right.
that's just what I've done for the last 20 years is use data, identify disparities, and then, sort of make the policy case for eliminating those disparities. And of course, we found that isn't necessarily a priority of this administration. The good news is that there's so many other use cases for the same data set that can actually be quite protective. And so, for example, thinking about the National Crime Victimization Survey, police chiefs use that data set so that they can better protect survivors of underreported crimes like sexual assault and domestic violence. So that data set helps police chiefs be better at their job. Or there's a data set called the FDA's Orange Book that determines if a generic drug can be safely substituted for a brand name drug. And so people use that all the time when they go to get a drug at the pharmacy. And so what I do is I have like a bunch of different stories in my back pocket. All of them are at essentialdata.us. And the key is finding something that the person you're talking to cares about. What we've seen work with journalists is just to shift their minds away from the jobs and the weather and the census data.
Right.
Right. And one example that works really well there is the North American Bat Monitoring Database, which is, I think, my favorite data set. Um, and you would think like, well, why does the federal government need to produce a database about bats? It turns out that bats, they provide billions of dollars of free services for America's farmers by eating harmful insects. And so if you want to protect that free service for the agricultural industry and especially those small family farmers, then you need to protect the bats. And the way you protect bats is by knowing where they are. Also, by knowing where the bats are, if you've got a business enterprise, you're trying to build a wind farm or expand your mining operation, you don't have to count all the bats to make sure that you're mitigating against harm of the bats. You can just go to the bat database and it helps streamline your permitting process. So it helps permitting be more efficient by having access to this bat database. And then there's also some surprising research that shows if bats are not protected and their populations dramatically decline in agricultural areas, that infant mortality rates go up because farmers have to use more pesticides, and that has a negative impact on infant mortality. So the scary thing about losing our federal data capacity is that we won't even know the harms that we're experiencing because it touches every corner of life in a modern society.
Okay. That bad example is
Yeah,
amazing.
that's a great example. Thank you, Denise.
Thanks for putting the link to your survey, Andy, in the chat. And while Andy puts that link in the chat, I really want to put another plug in for the newsletter that Beth was talking about. I subscribe to a lot of newsletters, and that is one of the few that I open every single time. Does not disappoint, will never fill your inbox with junk, and highly recommend that newsletter. And I haven't yet been to one of those 30-minute webinars, but it's on the list now. So I will be coming. Are there any other people in the room that want to that turn their microphone on and ask a question? In the meantime, speaking of the PRAMS data set, one of the things I think, if we heard you correctly, Denise, is that data is still being collected, but the CDC staff that normalized it is no longer working for the CDC or doing that if they are working. Are you aware of any, and we know this is not the only data set that's kind of having its post-processing done. I think part of the social vulnerability index is in the same boat where the data is still there, but nobody's creating the index. Are any of you aware at any of these links or any other universities of people kind of building a back-end engine that can do that, like building R code, building, some Stata protocols?
Yeah, there have been a few collections that have been where civil society has stepped in. For example, that the digital go bag
Oh, yeah.
for disaster managers. Esri, the
Mhm.
sort of market dominant
Mhm.
commercial GIS software provider, has sort of redone the links so that people can find all of those data sets that used to be in that collection. So they stepped up to fill the gap. There's another example, and this is often the case if a data set is a composite index, a composite of other data sets, then it's
Right.
easier for civil society or academia to step in. Another example with this would be the $1 billion disaster data set at NOAA that was terminated. Climate Central hired the researcher behind that who was let go from NOAA,
Oh.
and now they're actually making it better. They're going to make it $1 million disaster data set, and it may be living its best life over there at Climate Central rather than NOAA. But that's because it's a compile, like as long as the underlying
Mm.
data continue to flow, it'll be okay. But there are some data that only the federal government can produce just because of the scale and the mandate to cover all geographies and populations.
Mm.
I also it's worth going back in history. The Framingham Heart Study, which is like the premier study, like way that we understand the role of heart disease in America. Um, it uh, it came to be after FDR died of heart disease, and I think like 40% of Americans had heart disease at that point because smoking and other factors, and so Congress authorized this 20-year study. And so there was a lot of public buy-in for it. And then at the end of 20 years, the National Heart Institute announced that it was phasing out the study. And so the investigators, so this was federally funded and like a real sort of collaborative process with academia. The investigators looked for private funds, and they ended up raising stopgap funds from unlikely contributors, including the Tobacco Research Council and Oscar Mayer. And then the way that the data set got reinstated was like it was so DC. President Nixon's personal physician was examining him, like they had, an appointment, and he explained to the president why that heart study was so important. And so that was what prompted the refunding of the Framingham Heart Study, which continues today and has been expanded beyond the original, sort of generational study to be more inclusive.
All right. Another fantastic example. That so great. Um, Anybody, this is your last chance. We have time for probably one more question. Anybody want to turn their microphone on? If not, I will select one from the chat. While I'm looking for one in the chat, I think you both mentioned that. Oh, hey, go ahead, Bobby. Great to see you.
Yeah, hi, Heather. Hi, speakers. I would like to know, based on knowledge, what data has been affected regarding childcare services or social service as a whole? For my current work, I primarily use the census data, so it was off the page for a while. So is it currently back to the screen now as we speak today?
Yeah, you're bringing up something that is a real issue as we look at both the status of data sets and how they are used. And that is that often we don't even know about the value of a data set until it's gone. And whenever we talk to people about the data sets that they really depend on, what we hear from them is like this data is absolutely essential. We couldn't do our work without it. It does X, Y, and Z, but it's also not meeting our needs. It doesn't come out in a timely fashion. It's not detailed enough. It doesn't, we need more, we need more documentation, or it needs to be structured in this way. Or people aren't even aware of, I think there's like 20 different data sets about precipitation in the United States. And like which one do you use when? And so the federal data ecosystem, it's hard to find data sets that are relevant, and they often are an imperfect match, even if they are the best thing that we have available. And that's why this public participation that Beth was talking about is so important. It's not just about like rescuing the as is conditions of these data sets. It's actually about making sure that our federal data assets can meet the moment and set us up as a society to take advantage of upcoming opportunities and be prepared for challenges that come our way.
Fantastic. I think that is the perfect note for us to end on, because you all now have your one activity that you can do to help this situation, and also hopefully today has reminded you that data equity absolutely still matters, and the work that you're doing is still really important, and you are not alone in any of the work that you're doing or any of the experiences that you're having. So Denise and Beth, it means the world to us that you were willing to take this hour and talk through some of the issues that we're all experiencing on the ground. It really helps to know that you're thinking about this and using your really valuable experience to help us think about this. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having us, and
Yeah,
thank you to everyone who participated for just caring about data. It makes it easy to do this work when we know that lots of people care.
100%. Take really good care of yourselves. Take really good care of each other. You're doing fantastic work in a not always easy or fun world. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you next Friday. Same link, same time. Okay. Bye, everybody.